And so Bitcoin's kind of in that camp where in order to ban Bitcoin, you have to ban someone's ability to memorize 12 words, or to use open source software. And so the United States has the most kind of economic capacity to go after Bitcoin, but they also have the most checks and balances that can prevent them from doing that. I mean, until recently, during this whole multi-week period where there was no Speaker of the House, the acting Speaker of the House, he actually runs the Bitcoin white paper on Congress's website. He likes Bitcoin. And so for the multi-week period, the acting Speaker of the House, and it's still there, even though he's not the acting Speaker anymore, but literally Congress is hosting the Bitcoin white paper.
Renowned macro analyst and investment strategist Lyn Alden has become ever more bullish on Bitcoin over 2023. Alden, who is a prominent figure in the Bitcoin community, has been somewhat bullish on the crypto asset over the past 3 years. However, with the events that have unfolded throughout 2022 and 2023, Alden has revealed it's now her #1 asset. Lyn Alden's increasing bullishness on Bitcoin stems from her new book, Broken Money, where she critiques the current global financial system. She links the system's failure to widespread monetary debasement and the growing wealth divide. Her book points out that in contrast to advances in other areas, our monetary system remains outdated and harmful. Alden calls for a significant change towards a system based on scarcity, deflation, and decentralization, attributes she finds inherent in Bitcoin. She believes Bitcoin's rising adoption and the current economic challenges signal a move towards a Bitcoin standard era, which could result in a significant increase in both Bitcoin adoption and value. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video where Alden breaks down Bitcoin's biggest weak points and why it's now her #1 asset. Also, only a small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed. If you enjoy finance content, consider subscribing or liking the video. It's free and you can always change your mind. Now here's Lyn Alden with her Bitcoin outlook.
So as mentioned before, Bitcoin challenges the existing structure because Bitcoin and then to some extent stablecoins, they just go around financial borders in a way that prior monies don't. And that is both an opportunity and a kind of a risk from these different countries' perspective. And so basically what we're seeing in the past almost 15 years is just greater and greater monetization. I'm not aware of any other asset that has fallen 75 or 80% in price or more as many times as Bitcoin did and bounced back to new highs and just kind of kept going from there. You've had this kind of big long-term period of just more and more people understanding Bitcoin, wanting to hold some of their assets in Bitcoin, wanting to build companies on top of Bitcoin that make it easier to use. And so we're basically seeing the bootstrapping of an asset, of a new money, in a way that's pretty unusual. It's kind of like watching the internet build out, except you can also just directly buy a share of the internet. And that's kind of what we're seeing in this form. And so my long-term projection is, basically expecting to see greater and greater liquidity, greater and greater market cap in a volatile way. The bigger and more liquid the network gets, it should decrease its volatility over time, because a lot of the volatility we see is based on, one actor, one little offshore casino, for example, can leverage it up and then blow up, and that can cause volatility. And also, when you're in an early stage, any sort of startup company, for example, is basically an option on whether or not that company is going to succeed. It either goes up 10x, 100x, or it fails, right? And so any small shift that affects the perception or the probability that it's going to succeed or fail can dramatically change the price. Whereas, say once Bitcoin's been around for 30 years or 40 years and has reached, closer to its target addressable market, that just kind of more stabilizes, I think. So I think what we're seeing is the ongoing bootstrapping of a new money. It's being tested for various weaknesses or risks along the way. So far, it's succeeding them. It's proven to be anti-fragile. So it survived the Mt. Gox hack. It survived the China ban on miners. It survived attempts by its own industry to centralize it with a block size increase. It's gone through these various challenges, and it's kind of remained its core functionality in place. And I think that some of the biggest risks going forward is that when the U.S. government increasingly tries to go after self-custody and privacy, I don't think they really mind people holding Bitcoin in like a regulated silo, like an ETF, for example. But they don't particularly like people self-custodying their own Bitcoin, and they really don't like people making that Bitcoin private. And so I think that's the ongoing challenge. That's the kind of the next phase of test that I think Bitcoin has to go through. But that as long as no one can break it or centralize it, I think it's likely to continue taking market share from other assets over a multi-year period going into the 2030s. And so to the extent that the internet exists, it's very hard for government authorities to control the flow of information around it. And there's always a bit of a cat and mouse game. The network's always hardening to make its data harder to track. Basically different ways of bringing money around the world or transferring money around the world. But basically, as long as kind of the world doesn't itself get severed into two internets or something, which is possible. But basically now there's not just wires, but there's satellite internet. So to the extent that the internet remains not in a bubble, I think Bitcoin is likely to spread through all parts of that network. And that's just something that's very challenging for authorities to do much about. And the ones that really could go after it, like the United States, are bound by the fact that we have some degree of rule of law. For example, in the 1990s, Phil Zimmermann invented PGP, pretty good privacy, basically open source encryption. And the government didn't like that. They went after him with criminal lawsuits for exporting arms. That's how they went after him. And he said, okay, so then he just wrote it. He wrote the code in a book. He published a book that was the source code and said, well, now it's protected by the First Amendment. It's words and numbers. And the United States actually backed down. They had to change their laws around exporting, things like encryption. And there's also a case where people would put code, like encryption-based code, on a T-shirt, and the T-shirt would say, "This T-shirt cannot be exported. It's dangerous munitions." It's like a joke to point out how just certain laws just don't make sense in a certain world. You're now trying to restrict literally just someone's information, something that they came up with and can share freely. And so Bitcoin's kind of in that camp where, in order to ban Bitcoin, you have to ban someone's ability to memorize 12 words, or to use open source software. And so the United States has the most kind of economic capacity to go after Bitcoin, but they also have the most checks and balances that can prevent them from doing that. Until recently, during this whole multi-week period where there was no Speaker of the House, the acting Speaker of the House, he actually runs the Bitcoin white paper on Congress's website. He likes Bitcoin. And so for the multi-week period, the acting Speaker of the House, and it's still there, even though he's not the acting Speaker anymore, but literally Congress is hosting the Bitcoin white paper. And there's multiple pro-Bitcoin senators and congressmen and presidential candidates. And so it's just kind of a hard thing to stop unless someone can find a way to just critically impair it or centralize it. It's just kind of growing. And I think it's hard to get into a bubble unless you can make the internet itself a bubble. So I think that the smaller ones increasingly get challenged. And I think we've seen that in Lebanon. We're seeing that in Argentina, where if a smaller, weaker currency is unable to perform properly, then things like Bitcoin and stablecoins are more easily to rush in there, and people have an alternative now, right? So because those financial gates are down, you can go around the historical financial borders that existed. It's the threshold for governments to maintain their own currency is higher now. And so central banking was basically a tool to, when the world needed kind of a ledger that would settle, transactions, the government had the strong ability to kind of centralize everything. It's just kind of the way the incentive structure worked. And if you look back in the history of money over the past 200 years, most monetary efficiencies came at the cost of centralization. They said, okay, we can make this more efficient by centralizing it in this big bank. And then we can make that even more efficient by centralizing all these banks together into a super bank. right? And so that's kind of been the history of money. And what Bitcoin represents is the first technology that kind of says, okay, you can have this efficiency, but it's actually more decentralized now. It actually kind of breaks that trend. And so it's kind of inherently anti-central bank technology. But again, it's early, it's nascent, it's being tested. It doesn't have nearly the network effects or liquidity that the dollar system has, that the euro system has. And so it's basically this rising disruptor against these powerful incumbents that just increasingly makes what they do irrelevant, but not unless it gets to a bigger scale. And they only get to bigger scales kind of one country at a time. So for example, these technologies, including stablecoins, can rival countries like Lebanon or Argentina and say, well, if you're going to mismanage your ledger, people are going to flood over to these other monies. And that can kind of just work its way up the chain until we see how the biggest currencies deal with this fact, especially because as the beginning of the discussion went, many of them are going through sovereign debt crises.
So there's Lyn Alden and her bullish stance on Bitcoin. Alden's expertise and her book Broken Money shed light on the need for a financial system overhaul, suggesting that Bitcoin could be at the forefront of this revolution. Before we sign off, don't forget to hit that like button if you found this content valuable, and consider subscribing to stay ahead of the curve in the financial world. Remember, subscribing is completely free and you're free to change your mind at any time. Anyway guys, hope you enjoyed today's video and that provided you with some value. I'll see you all in the next one, and as always, all the best.